One of the absolute fiercest debates in American elections really just boils down to one question. Should you have to prove, with a document, that you're a citizen just to register to vote? Today, we're going to break down the SAVE Act. It's a proposal to make that the law of the land. We'll look at the arguments for it and the very real fears about who might get left behind in the process.
And really, everything comes back to this one fundamental question. It's a tightrope walk, right? On one side, you want perfect election integrity, not a single ineligible person casting a ballot. But on the other, you want maximum participation, making sure every single eligible citizen can vote without jumping through a bunch of hoops. As you're about to see, those two goals can be in direct conflict.
So this conflict gives us two completely different philosophies. For decades, the U.S. system has been what you could call accessibility by design. It's built to be as easy as possible to get into. You just sign on the dotted line under penalty of perjury and you're in. The idea is we trust voters first and then verify later if something looks fishy. But now there's a big push for a different model, verification at entry. This one demands proof right at the front door before you can even get on the list.
And that brings us to the specific proposal that's trying to make this shift happen nationwide. It's called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or as most people call it, the SAVE Act.
So what is this thing exactly? Well, the SAVE Act is a federal bill that wants to completely rewrite the rules of voter registration. Its main goal is to force every single person registering for a federal election to show documentary proof of their U.S. citizenship. And let me be clear, this isn't some minor tweak. We're talking about a foundational change to a system that's been around for more than 30 years. Now, what's really interesting here is how specific the law is. We are not talking about just any old ID. The Act lays out a very clear, very specific list of acceptable documents. You'd need a real ID that actually says you're a citizen, or a passport, specific military records, or the original documents like a birth certificate or your naturalization papers. That standard driver's license that millions of legal non-citizen residents have? Nope, that wouldn't be enough.
And this just perfectly illustrates the brand new workload this would put on states. It's basically a three-step mandate. First, election officials literally can't process a registration without one of those approved documents in hand. Second, places like the DMV have to explicitly ask about citizenship before they can even offer you a registration form. And third, states would be required to actively scrub their voter rolls and remove anyone they identify as a non-citizen.
Okay, so that's the proposal. But as you can imagine, there's some fierce opposition. And it all centers on this idea that critics call the paperwork gap. The argument is actually pretty simple. What if you are a 100% American citizen, but you just don't have one of those specific documents? Maybe your birth certificate was lost in a move, or you've never had the money or the need for a passport. The core criticism is that this law creates a massive barrier for those folks. In fact, some research suggests that over 21 million voting-age citizens don't have easy access to these kinds of documents. Opponents have started using this really powerful phrase to describe what the law would do. They argue that, okay, it's not a literal tax on voting, but the cost to get these documents, paying for a new birth certificate, taking a day off work, maybe traveling to a government office, it all functions in the exact same way. It becomes a financial hurdle you have to clear just to exercise your right to vote.
And critics point out that this so-called poll tax doesn't affect everyone equally. The groups that are often identified as being hit the hardest are folks with low incomes, the elderly, students, people with disabilities. For someone on a fixed income or who has trouble getting around, the whole process of hunting down these documents can be incredibly difficult, and that leads to real fears of disproportionate disenfranchisement. And beyond the paperwork, there's a big technical problem. The SAVE Act would rely on federal databases to check citizenship. The thing is, these systems were never designed for elections. The biggest risk is something called lagging data. So, picture this. Someone becomes a naturalized citizen today, but the database might not get updated for weeks, maybe even months. In that gap, they could be incorrectly flagged as a non-citizen and kicked off the voter rolls even though they are a perfectly legal voter.
So you might be thinking, well, if a state wants to do this, why don't they just do it? And that's a great question. There's a huge legal reason, and it's why this entire fight is happening at the federal level.
Okay, this is the key. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which most people know as the Motor Voter Law, was passed specifically to make registering to vote easier. It created one standard federal form that every single state has to accept. And that form was intentionally designed to only require your signature, attesting that you're a citizen. It's the very foundation of that accessibility by design philosophy we talked about. And then the Supreme Court basically locked that standard into place. Back in 2013, the court ruled that because federal law sets the rules for the federal form, states can't just tack on their own requirements, like demanding a birth certificate. They can't make it any harder to use that federal form.
So the crucial point here is this. The NVRA acts as a giant legal roadblock. States that want to pass these kinds of proof of citizenship laws are basically blocked by it. The only way to make this system the national standard is to change the federal law itself. And that is exactly what the SAVE Act is designed to do. It would amend the NVRA and clear that legal path.
This whole debate can feel very, very American. But you have to wonder, are there other ways to solve this problem? To figure that out, let's take a quick look at a completely different model used in other parts of the world.
A lot of European countries, think Estonia or Denmark, have a totally different way of doing things. They use a state-issued digital ID system. Your citizenship status is literally baked right into your digital ID. So whenever it's time to register for something, especially voting, the verification is instant and it's electronic. It's a true verification at entry model that just completely sidesteps this whole debate about physical paperwork.
Now, while that sounds super efficient, trying to do that here in the US would face some enormous obstacles. First, there are huge privacy concerns about the government having a centralized ID on everyone. There's also this deep-seated political resistance to the idea of a national voter database, which really clashes with our tradition of states running their own elections. And then there's the practical side. It could create a digital divide, leaving behind people who don't have reliable access to technology.
And that brings us right back to the central dilemma, doesn't it? There are no easy answers here. The entire debate really just boils down to a fundamental trade-off. Which mistake is worse, an era of inclusion where maybe one ineligible person gets to vote, or an era of exclusion where maybe 5 eligible citizens are blocked from voting? Your answer to that question probably determines exactly where you stand on the SAVE Act. Thanks for joining us for this Explainer.